What's up guys, Justin here with the Fusion Essentials. So in today's video, we're going to talk a little bit more about how materials can affect your renderings in Fusion 360. Setting up your materials properly can be very important for getting a good rendered result. So if you have any questions about anything we talk about, feel free to leave them down below. Let's go ahead and just jump into it. Okay, and so we're going to start from the very beginning. And what we're going to do is we're going to start by drawing a simple rectangular shape. So I'm going to create a sketch right here. We're going to draw a rectangle and I'm going to make it fairly small. This is going to be important a little bit later, but for now we're just going to kind of move our mouse down here and we're just going to draw maybe a 4" by 4" shape like this. And then we're going to extrude it up a little bit and we're going to bevel the corners. So I'll extrude it up to like 0.2 inches and we're going to go ahead and we're going to add a chamfer to the edges. So we're just going to do something like this. And so now we've got a base shape inside of Fusion 360. And we'll work with other shapes in a minute, but first what I want to do is I want to take this and I want to move it over into rendered mode so we can take a look at this. So to do that, you can click on the drop down right here and go to render. And when you do that, that's going to take you into rendered mode. Now, at the moment, this is not very exciting, right? Because it basically looks like a piece of metal that light is reflecting off of. That's because the material that is the default inside of Fusion 360 is a metal material. And so you can see this by going into the appearance settings, either here or within your design. You can click on the modify option and click on appearance. It doesn't really matter. You can work with these in either place. But in this situation, let's do this inside of rendered mode. So we're going to go to rendered mode. We're going to go to appearance and notice how right now there's a note that says steel satin is in this design, right? That means that currently the steel satin material is contained in this design and that's what's being rendered. Now, we've talked about this a little bit in the past, but down below there's an option to select different material library objects that Fusion 360 contains. So, for example, let's just go with the very first thing in here, which is a concrete. We can take this concrete material and we can apply it to this object right here. Now, notice how this material is actually, it doesn't look very good because it's super large. And so what you need to think about when you're dealing with materials is you need to think about the fact that materials in general have real world sizes associated with them, right? So say for example that you wanted a number of tiles or something like that, those tiles are going to have a certain size, whether that's 2 inches, 4 inches, whatever. Well, remember that we drew this shape to be 4" by 4". So this concrete material is actually really big on this surface. Or actually it's not really big, it just looks really big. Now you do have options in here, so you can edit these materials that are in your design by right clicking on them and clicking on the option for edit. Notice if I do this, I can bring the scale of that material way down, like this. And when I bring the scale of that material way down, it's going to resize for this object right here. Now, you want to be a little bit careful when you're doing this, only because if you go into your advanced settings and you try to preview this material, so if you go into your preview mode right here and you look at the different preview options you have that are going to show you how this material looks, if you come in here in your simple settings, so inside of your edit right here, you bring that scale way down and then you go into the advanced like this. Notice how, because it's really small, it doesn't really look very good on this object. So a lot of the time what I recommend is modeling things to real world scale and then trying to avoid adjusting these materials as much as possible. So in this case, right, if we're using a concrete material, we're probably dealing with something bigger than 4" by 4" anyway. So we might want something within our design that's going to be a little bit bigger. So I might come in here and create a sketch, and instead of it being 4" by 4", if we're doing something that's going to be large with concrete, it's probably more like 10 feet by 10 feet right here. Right, so we're going to draw this sketch right here, and I've gotten lost in my 3D space. There we go. We're going to finish our sketch, but then what we want to do is we want to extrude this up. Well, in this case, something like that, you're probably going to have a thickness of like 6 inches or something like that, or 4 inches, depending on your slab. But if we make this 4 inches, and then we were to jump back into rendered mode and we apply that same concrete material to this surface, notice how this is actually sized out kind of properly in here, and it actually looks good on your surface. So just note that material size and tiling size is going to make a difference inside of this 3D space. Now in this situation, we probably don't want to model something that big. That would be more if you were modeling a building. So we can go back to this object right here, but I did want to make sure we talked about material size and scale. And so there's really 2 different kinds of materials that are in here. So there are kinds of materials in here like this one that are basically taking an image and tiling it across your surface, right? And if you right click on this, you edit it, then you go into your advanced settings, you can actually see the images that are being used in order to create that material. So notice what this is doing is this is just retiling this image over and over and over again. And we'll take a look at creating a custom material in a second. But the other kinds of materials that are in here are things like paints and things that aren't necessarily, they're not necessarily repeating an image across a surface as much as they're just basically applying a color and then applying a certain reflectivity value. So let's say, for example, that we wanted to bring in this blue paint material right here. Notice how down below you can download most of these materials just by clicking this little button right here. They're in the Fusion 360 library. But if I click and drag on this surface like this, notice how I've got this paint material that's been applied to this surface. And so this paint material has different properties associated with it. And so, for example, if I right click on this and go to edit, notice how this has a color associated with it. So I could change that color by clicking and dragging right here, but then I can also adjust the roughness. And what the roughness is the roughness sets how much light is reflected off of an object like this. So notice how, and I'm going to go into my scene settings and I'm going to adjust my environment a little bit. So I'm just going to adjust the position of that environment. So when I move it around, notice how now I can see a reflection on this surface from that environment model. So this would just be the lighting setup in here. We're just going to use this as an example, but notice how with this material, you can adjust how much they reflect by adjusting this roughness value right here. In addition, you can also adjust the reflectance value, which is basically going to adjust how much light is coming off of this, right? Notice how this isn't really adjusting the fact that something from the lighting environment is reflecting on this surface right here. It's more affecting how much light is coming off of this surface. Now, there are advanced functions in here that you can adjust. We're not going to worry too much about those for right now, but basically these materials are not tiling a texture, they are just applying a certain look. And so let's add a couple shapes in here. And I'm not going to make you watch me do this, so it'll probably just cut to having shapes on. Okay, so now we've got some shapes in here, and I want to take a look at what different materials do in rendered mode. So we're going to jump back into rendered mode right here, and let's apply some additional materials in here. So we're going to go into our appearance. We've been using the enamel glossy paints, but let's say we wanted to bring in one of these flake paints. So I'm just going to drag this flake paint onto this sphere right here. Well, one thing you're going to notice about this material is it acts a little bit different than this glossy paint right here. What this one does is it acts as if there's kind of like flakes in the paint right here. And I don't want to get too far into that. Like, you can go into the editing and you can adjust things about this material. And so I don't want to get like way in the weeds on this, but just know that this material is using kind of a bump on it as well as a red material and a gloss in order to create this look. Now, if we were to come in here and we were to apply one of the other materials, so let's say, for example, that we wanted to pick one of these plastics, again, these plastics are going to look different and they're going to act different. Like this nylon material right here, which is basically like a 3D printer material, notice how this reflects light in a different way. Like there's still a little bit of reflection coming off of it, but it's not glossy like the materials that you have over here. Those map settings and the settings contained inside of the materials are going to basically adjust the way those materials work. And so sometimes you've got materials that are actually transparent. So if I go into the transparent settings right here, notice how there are presets for things like the phenolic, the polycarbonate, and let's pick one of those. Let's pick the polycarbonate material right here. So I'm just going to download that, and I'm going to drop it on this box, and I'm going to remove the previous material. And so notice how with this polycarbonate material, you can actually see through it. And you might see it a little bit better if we do an in-canvas render right here. Notice what this does is this is actually bending the way that the light travels through the object based on the shape right here. So you can apply materials to objects that are transparent or see-through like this, which give you really interesting results, but they allow you to do really cool things. We'll toggle that render back off because it's pretty heavy on your computer when you're doing that. And so what I really want you to understand is just the fundamentals of within different materials, roughness is going to set how much an object reflects inside your 3D space. So in this case, notice how this is setting the reflection of the objects. It's making it look more dull. Notice how if I bring the reflectance down, that's going to affect how much the light is reflecting off of the object. But you can adjust those things really quickly within the materials themselves. But then I also want you to understand how to deal with the materials that actually have the texture applied to them. So let's go down into our wood section for a second. And let's say that we were to drag a mahogany wood material on here. Well, notice how when we do this, first of all, that wood material is a little bit big, and we can go ahead and we can edit it a little bit for this example. But notice how as I bring that scale down, this is going to actually look more like a real world material. But when you're dealing with a material like this one, what's happening is instead of you dealing with something like the paint, right, which just has a roughness value, these materials are going to have different maps associated with them. Those maps make changes to the way that the materials act. So if I right click on this material in this design and I edit it, first off, we've got all of our regular materials, right? So if I bring the roughness down and the reflectance up on this object, I'm going to get a little bit more reflection on this object, but we're not getting a ton, right? It's nothing like the glossy paint or anything like that. This just isn't a very reflective material. Well, part of the reason for that is if we go into our advanced settings, notice how this has a roughness map applied to it. And so instead of something like your paint material, right? If you go into your paint material and you're advanced, it just has a roughness value, but there's no map because it's just kind of uniform. If you go into something like your mahogany material, notice how there's a roughness map in here, which is basically an image file that contains information about the way that light will reflect off of the object. This map is something that is setting how much and where light is going to reflect. And it does that by using a grayscale image like this one. And so basically this is an image that contains information about where light should reflect. So I can't remember if it's the light areas are more reflective or the dark areas are more reflective, but basically how light or how dark this map is setting the way that light is going to reflect off of this object. And so this is a great way to get more realistic materials in here because you can get real world data from these maps that's going to affect the way that this material looks like this. And so let's say we wanted to create our own material. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to download a material and bring it in so that we can take a look at what some of these maps do. And so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to duplicate this mahogany material. So I'm just going to right click on it and there's an option you can kind of see that says duplicate, and we're just going to create our own material and we're just going to edit this and we're going to call this custom tile. And what we're going to do is we're going to go download our own image and bring it in because you can bring in custom images to Fusion 360. So in this case, we're going to go to a website called CG Bookcase and we can download this. So CG Bookcase is going to have materials that you can download and use. And I believe they're CCO, meaning you don't need to provide any kind of credit or anything like that if you end up using them in your designs. But in this case, what we want to do is we want to download the the material files for this dark ocean tiles 04. Notice how there are different resolutions of the materials. Higher resolution is going to equal higher detail and higher resolution texture images basically, but it's going to come at the cost of them being much larger files. I downloaded the 2K materials, which downloaded a zip file. Okay, and so what I want you to do is I want you to take a look at the files that are downloaded in here. So I'm just going to view these as extra large icons. So notice what this comes with is this comes with multiple different image files that contain different data. Like for example, this is the base color file, which is basically just the texture image that's repeated along your surface. But this also comes with an ambient occlusion file, which you don't need to worry too much about for this video. It comes with a height map and a normal map, which can both make your materials look bumpy and more 3D in your renderings. So basically what this does is this contains height data in an RGB format that you can bring in, and this helps Fusion 360 simulate the way that a material might look in 3D. But then there's also the roughness map. And notice with the roughness map, you've got the darks in here, which are containing data about where light should reflect. And then you've got the lights, which are containing data about more how the light shouldn't reflect. So you should get more realistic reflections off of that object using these maps. But let's jump back into Fusion 360 and let's create a custom material. So we've already created this custom tile material, but what we need to do is we need to double click on it, go into advanced, and we need to replace those image files, right? So first off, we want to bring the base color into the image file right here. So we're just going to go to edit image from this dropdown, and you can click on that image file or that image name and replace the color map right here. So we're going to click into this, and so we're going to adjust this sample size so that these tiles look a little bit better. So I'm going to bring this down maybe to like 12 inches by 12 inches, and click on done. And so what I want to do is I want to take this material file. I'm going to click on OK. I'm going to drag that and place it on this object. Well, notice how this is tiling that tile material on this surface. Then we can come in here and we can edit the scale on this to make it a little bigger or a little smaller. Note that sometimes you have to do some things with the UV mapping in here to make everything line up. UV mapping is just the tool basically that something like Fusion 360 uses in order to place materials on surfaces. We're not going to worry too much about that for right now, but I want to go back in, and now I want to load a different roughness map because notice how this isn't reflecting very much right now. That's because it still has that mahogany wood roughness map, and we want something else. So we're going to click on this. We're going to go find this roughness map right here. And one thing we do want to do again is we want to make sure this is the same size as the other image that we created. So we want this to be a 12 by 12, and you may need to click on this little button right here to unlock the aspect ratio. But we're going to click on done right here. Well, notice how now this is a much more reflective material, right? And so the reason it's more reflective is because this roughness map is a lot darker than the other roughness map. But notice how we're still getting some kind of like weird results in here. And the reason we're getting weird results in here is because this still has the normal map associated with it from the wood material. So we're going to right click, we're going to go to edit, and if we scroll down into the relief pattern right here, we want to click on this drop down and we want to edit that image, and we want to bring in that other material right here. So we're going to go find our normal map, and we want to go ahead and make sure that we've set this image to the same size as the other images. So if I click in here, notice how this was a 12 by 12. We want to make sure that we set the roughness to a 12 by 12, and we want to set our bump map or our normal map to 12 by 12. And so one other thing that we want to make sure that we do is we want to scroll down into our advanced settings, and we want to change this from a height map to a normal map because they're different kinds of data. Notice how that made a significant difference in the way that this tile has kind of like ups and downs in here. Like now you can see that this has an up and down in here like this, and it's affecting the way that light reflects off of this surface. And so with that normal map, notice how you can adjust this using this slider right here to set how pronounced that look is. Now, there is a difference between a normal map and a height map. So if we were to pick a different material, right? Remember that we have a height map in here. So we're going to bring the height map in here and we're going to change this data type to height map. Notice how with the height map, you're getting a little bit more of almost a displacement effect. And I'm not sure exactly how Fusion 360 handles displacement. So what displacement usually does is it creates a bunch of ups and downs on your surface. In this case, we don't want this to be anywhere near this pronounced, right? We want this to be like 0.01 or 0.05 or something like that. But notice what this height map is doing is it's giving you a little bit more relief on this surface. You can kind of play around with this and pick either one of those either one of those options and just see which one looks better. They're just two different ways of getting this kind of like 3D relief effect in here. But notice how if I look at this, I'm getting like a very subway tile, or I'm getting a very realistic tile look inside of your model. So if you're bringing in custom materials like this one, you want to make sure that you bring in all of those maps as well, because it's going to make your materials look a lot better. Okay, and so one last thing that we want to do, because this does look a little bit weird, right? Your materials aren't really aligned in here. And so what it's doing is it's giving you this kind of like disconnected look around the outside. Well, what we can do is we can right click on the object, and notice how this gives you an option for texture map controls, or you can click up here for texture map controls. What that's going to do is that's going to allow you to select an object and tell Fusion 360 how to project the textures. So in this case, right, I don't necessarily want it to be automatic. I maybe want it to be the box mapping. So what the box mapping is going to do is it's going to come in here and it's going to try to like use a box shape in order to try to map this on the surface. There's also a spherical option, which the shape isn't spherical, so it's not going to work very well. And there's a planar option, which you can use in order to try to like set the plane direction of the materials like this. So that one's not always going to do what you want it to do, but notice how you can kind of like play around with this, right? The planar is going to set if this is mapping this straight up and down, or how this is placed on here, and then you can use kind of the arrows to adjust this. So you're going to want to kind of play around with this until you get a mapping that you like, but a lot of the time you can use these texture map controls in order to make your materials map onto a surface a lot easier. And so notice how when you do your final render, this is going to look a lot better than the preview render that's in here. So the way that this material reflects, for example, is very realistic because of those maps that we've brought in. So do highly recommend that if you can find textures and texture maps that do what you want, bring them in, because they're going to make your renders look a lot better. All right, so that should give you a good idea of how to work with textures and renderings inside of Fusion 360. If you have any questions about anything we talked about, feel free to leave them down below. In the next video, we're going to talk about lighting and environments. So as always, thank you so much for taking the time to watch this, and I'll catch you in the next video. Thanks, guys.